My co-pilot Creed was talking to dead passengers. At 3 a.m., 30,000 feet above Kansas, Creed started offering drinks to empty seats. He couldn't see that rows 12 through 18 were vacant. I could. But he kept insisting the passengers were scared about incoming turbulence. No turbulence was forecasted. Our instruments showed clear skies. Then I remembered Flight 447. Same route, same seats, all dead 5 years ago. Creed was serving ghosts. Welcome to VerifiedFears Horror Family. These 11 airline horror stories will change how you see flying forever. Night shift workers reveal the most disturbing encounters at airports and aircraft. From control tower voices to bleeding suitcases. From vanishing fuel thieves to passengers who shouldn't exist. You'll never feel safe at cruising altitude again. These stories will haunt your next flight. My co-pilot Creed was talking to dead passengers at 30,000 feet. The empty seats in rows 12 through 18 were somehow filled with voices only he could hear. I'm Freya, and I've been flying commercial aircraft for United Airlines for 12 years. I've seen everything from medical emergencies to engine failures, but nothing prepared me for what happened on Flight 447 from Seattle to Miami 3 months ago. It was a typical red-eye departure, scheduled to leave SeaTac at 11:47 p.m. and arrive in Miami at 7:15 a.m. Eastern Time. The passenger load was light, only 17 souls on board, which isn't unusual for a Tuesday night flight in November. Most passengers settled in quickly, pulling blankets over their heads and dimming their reading lights within the first hour of flight. Creed had been my co-pilot for 8 months, and we worked well together. He was methodical, precise, and had an excellent understanding of weather patterns across the southern flight corridor. During our pre-flight briefing, everything checked out perfectly. Weather was clear from Washington State through Texas, with only minor headwinds that would add maybe 10 minutes to our flight time. The Boeing 737-800 had just completed its scheduled maintenance cycle 2 days prior, and all systems were functioning within normal parameters. The first 3 hours of flight were completely routine. We maintained our assigned altitude of 35,000 feet, navigating around a small weather system over northern Colorado before settling into the smooth air over Kansas. I was reviewing our fuel consumption reports when I noticed Creed adjusting his headset and looking back toward the passenger cabin. At first, I thought he might be checking on a flight attendant call light or responding to some passenger request. But our cabin crew hadn't contacted the cockpit since takeoff. "Everything all right?" I asked him, keeping one eye on our navigation display. We were still 2 hours out from Miami, flying over the dark expanse of the Great Plains, with nothing but scattered farmhouse lights visible below us. Creed nodded, but continued glancing toward the cabin. Just listening to the passengers. Some of them seemed concerned about the ride getting rough. He reached for his flight manual and started flipping through the weather section, which struck me as odd since our meteorological radar wasn't showing any precipitation or turbulence ahead of us. I checked our passenger manifest on the electronic flight bag. 17 passengers total, distributed mostly in the forward cabin, with only 3 people seated aft of row 10. The cabin was unusually quiet, which made sense given that most red-eye passengers try to sleep through the entire flight. I glanced back through the cockpit door's small window and could see our lead flight attendant, Sarah, reading a magazine at her jump seat. The cabin lighting was dimmed to night mode, and I could make out the silhouettes of sleeping passengers, their seats reclined and blankets pulled up. 20 minutes later, Creed started speaking in a low, conversational tone. At first, I thought he was talking to me, but when I looked over, he was facing the cabin and nodding as if responding to someone. His voice was calm and reassuring, the same tone he used when making passenger announcements during normal turbulence. "I understand your concern. he was saying quietly. "We're monitoring the weather conditions very closely, and I want you to know that we've flown this route hundreds of times. The turbulence you're worried about typically doesn't develop until we're further south, around the Arkansas-Louisiana border." He paused, as if listening to a response. No. You don't need to worry about that. Modern aircraft are designed to handle much more stress than anything Mother Nature can throw at us." I felt a chill run down my spine. Creed was having a detailed conversation with someone, but our intercom system wasn't activated, and I couldn't hear any voices coming through the cabin communication system. I pressed the flight attendant call button, and Sarah appeared at the cockpit door within 30 seconds. "Is everything okay up here?" she asked, glancing between Creed and me with a concerned expression. "Sarah, are any passengers awake back there? Anyone expressing concerns about turbulence or asking questions about the flight?" I kept my voice low, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily. She looked puzzled. "No, Captain. Everyone's been asleep for the past hour. It's been the quietest red-eye I've worked in months." "Why do you ask?" I glanced at Creed, who was still facing the cabin and occasionally nodding. He seemed completely absorbed in his conversation with invisible passengers. "Has anyone from the cabin tried to contact the cockpit in the last 20 minutes?" "Not at all. The cabin's been completely peaceful." "Should I check on something specific?" Sarah's expression grew more concerned as she noticed Creed's behavior. "No, that's fine. Thanks, Sarah. Just checking on passenger comfort." I waited until she returned to her station before addressing my co-pilot directly. "Creed, who exactly are you talking to?" I tried to keep my voice steady and professional, but I could feel anxiety building in my chest. He turned toward me with a genuinely confused expression. "The passengers in rows 12 through 18. They're asking about the weather conditions ahead of us. Apparently, some of them have experienced severe turbulence on this route before, and they're concerned about what we might encounter over Arkansas." He gestured toward the cabin as if the conversation was perfectly normal. I pulled up our seating chart on the electronic display. Rows 12 through 18 were completely empty. According to our passenger manifest, the furthest back anyone was seated was row 11, and that was an elderly gentleman who had been fast asleep since before we reached cruising altitude. The entire aft section of our aircraft was vacant. "Creed, look at the seating chart," I said, angling the display so he could see it clearly. "There's nobody sitting in those rows. The back of the plane is empty." He studied the screen for a moment, then looked back toward the cabin with a frown. "That's strange. The system must be showing outdated information. I can clearly see people back there. There's a woman in 12A with dark hair wearing a blue sweater. She's particularly worried because she was on a flight last year that hit severe turbulence over this same area. And there's a businessman in 14C who keeps checking his watch and asking about our arrival time." The hair on my arm stood up. I grabbed our flight operations manual and quickly looked up the accident history for Flight 447. What I found made my blood run cold. 5 years and 3 months ago, United Flight 447 on the same Seattle to Miami route had encountered an unexpected severe thunderstorm over southeastern Kansas. The aircraft had hit turbulence so violent that it caused rapid decompression and structural failure, sending the plane into an uncontrollable dive. All passengers and crew were killed instantly when the aircraft impacted the ground at nearly 400 miles per hour. I scrolled through the accident report with trembling hands. The passenger manifest from that fatal flight showed that rows 12 through 18 had been fully occupied. Seat 12A had been assigned to Rebecca Martinez, a 34-year-old marketing executive with dark hair who was traveling to Miami for a business conference. Seat 14C had been occupied by James Patterson, a businessman who had been scheduled to present at an 8 a.m. meeting and was known to be obsessive about punctuality. "Creed," I said, trying to keep panic out of my voice. "I need you to look at our weather radar very carefully. Tell me what you see ahead of us." He adjusted the radar display and studied it intently. Mostly clear skies. There's a small cell developing about 60 miles southeast of our position. But it's weak and shouldn't affect our flight path. Why? The radar was showing exactly what I saw. Clear conditions ahead with only minor weather activity well off our route. But according to the accident report, the fatal Flight 447 had encountered a rapidly developing supercell thunderstorm that hadn't appeared on weather radar until it was too late to avoid. The storm had formed in the exact location where Creed was now reporting minor weather activity. I made the decision that probably saved all our lives. Kansas City Center, United 447 requesting immediate deviation 30 miles south of course due to passenger comfort concerns. We'd like to avoid any potential turbulence in the area. United 447, approved as requested. Maintain flight level 350 and advise when ready to resume navigation. As we banked left to begin our deviation, Creed continued his conversation with the invisible passengers. "Yes, I can see you're feeling better now that we're changing course. That's good. The captain is very experienced with weather avoidance, and we're going to give that area a wide berth tonight." He paused, listening to something I couldn't hear. "You're welcome. Try to get some rest for the remainder of the flight." 20 minutes later, as we were settling back onto our original flight path, the weather radar exploded with activity. A massive thunderstorm cell had rapidly developed exactly where we would have been if we hadn't deviated. The storm was showing extreme weather with hail, severe turbulence, and rotating supercell characteristics. The kind of weather system that could tear an aircraft apart. Kansas City Center, United 447. Looks like we dodged a bullet tonight. That storm cell developed very quickly. Roger, United 447. We're showing that system as extremely dangerous with reports of funnel cloud activity. Good call on the early deviation. For the rest of the flight, Creed gradually stopped his conversations with the phantom passengers. By the time we began our descent into Miami, he was back to normal, discussing approach procedures and runway conditions as if nothing unusual had happened. When I asked him about the passengers in rows 12 through 18, he looked genuinely puzzled and said he didn't remember talking to anyone during the flight. We landed safely at 7:22 a.m., only 7 minutes behind schedule despite our weather deviation. As our 17 passengers deplaned, I watched carefully to see if anyone matched the descriptions Creed had given me. There was no woman with dark hair and a blue sweater, no punctual businessman checking his watch. Just 17 tired travelers who had slept through what might have been their own salvation. I never flew with Creed again after that night. Not because I doubted his flying ability, but because I understood that sometimes the dead care more about the living than we realize. Flight 447's original passengers had tried to save us from repeating their fate, speaking through the only person on board who could hear their warnings. Sometimes the most disturbing horror stories are actually tales of supernatural protection. Guardian angels wearing the faces of tragedy's victims, ensuring that history's darkest moments don't repeat themselves in the skies above America. The container shouldn't have been breathing, but I could see it expanding and contracting in the dim cargo hold light. Something alive was trapped inside, and it had been watching me through the ventilation holes for the past 10 minutes. I'm Piper, and I've worked the graveyard shift in LAX's cargo operations for 6 years. People think loading luggage onto planes is mindless work, but you'd be wrong. Every piece of cargo has documentation, weight specifications, and handling requirements. We're responsible for balance distribution that keeps aircraft stable during flight, and one mistake can kill everyone on board. The night shift pays better because most people don't want to work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., but I've always been a night owl, and the overtime helps support my 2 kids. October 15th started like any other Tuesday night. I clocked in at 10:47 p.m. and headed to Terminal 4, where 3 wide-body aircraft were scheduled for cargo loading. The first 2 planes were routine, mostly mail containers and standard freight bound for Chicago and Denver. But United Flight 1247 to Frankfurt was different. It was carrying a mix of commercial freight and several priority containers that had arrived late in the evening with special handling instructions. The cargo manifest showed 5 priority containers, each marked with red expedite stickers and documentation requiring signatures at every checkpoint. These types of shipments usually contain high-value electronics, medical supplies, or time-sensitive business materials. The paperwork indicated the containers had originated from a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles and needed to be loaded last to ensure quick offloading in Frankfurt. I was working alone in the cargo hold, which isn't unusual for night shifts when staffing runs thin. The cavernous belly of the Boeing 777 echoed with every movement, and the industrial lighting cast long shadows between the cargo nets and restraint systems. I had loaded the first 4 priority containers without incident, securing them according to the weight distribution chart, when I noticed something odd about the 5th container. It was identical to the others in size and marking. But when I grabbed the handling straps to lift it onto the cargo loader, the container felt wrong. Not just heavy, but unbalanced, as if the contents were shifting around inside. Standard freight containers are packed tightly to prevent movement during flight, so any shifting cargo is a serious safety concern. I set it back down and walked around to examine it more carefully. The container was a standard aluminum unit, about 4 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet deep, with ventilation holes along the top edge. Most cargo containers don't have ventilation unless they're designed for live animal transport. But this one was marked as general freight. I crouched down to check the documentation again, and that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from inside the container. My first thought was that someone had mistakenly shipped a pet in a freight container, which is both illegal and dangerous. Animals require special pressurization and temperature controls during flight, and a standard cargo container would be a death trap at cruising altitude. I grabbed my radio to contact the cargo supervisor, but before I could key the microphone, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It wasn't an animal scratching. It was someone tapping in a deliberate pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. SOS in Morse code. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear against the container. The tapping continued, weak but persistent. Someone was alive inside that container, and they were trying to communicate. I immediately radioed for emergency response, but the night supervisor, Rodriguez, told me to hold my position while he contacted security. Protocol requires that any suspicious cargo be isolated and examined by federal authorities before anyone attempts to open it. While waiting for security, I noticed that the ventilation holes were slightly larger than normal, and when I shone my flashlight through one of them, I could see movement inside. Not the random movement of loose cargo, but the deliberate, careful movement of something trying to stay hidden. I whispered into the ventilation hole, Can you hear me? If you can hear me, tap twice. 2 clear taps came back immediately. Are you hurt? Tap once for yes, twice for no. 1 tap. How many people are in there with you? No response for several seconds, then 5 distinct taps. My hands were shaking as I realized I had stumbled onto what appeared to be a human trafficking operation. 5 people were crammed into a container barely large enough for 1 person, likely without adequate air, water, or space to move. They would never survive the 8-hour flight to Frankfurt, especially at the reduced oxygen levels in the cargo hold. Security arrived 12 minutes later, but it wasn't airport security. 3 men in dark suits with federal badges approached the container with equipment I didn't recognize. They ordered me to step back while they conducted their examination. But instead of trying to communicate with the people inside, they seemed more interested in the container's external markings and documentation. "Sir," I said to the lead agent, "there are people inside that container. They're injured, and they've been signaling for help. We need to get them out immediately." The agent looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mr. Piper, I need you to understand that this is now a federal investigation. You're not to discuss what you've seen here with anyone, including other airport personnel. We'll handle the situation from here. But they need medical attention. They've been tapping SOS signals and—" "I understand your concern. But these individuals are part of an ongoing operation. Opening that container prematurely could compromise months of investigative work and put more lives at risk." Something about his response didn't feel right. If this was a rescue operation, why weren't there paramedics on scene? Why wasn't anyone making an effort to communicate with the people inside? I watched from a distance as the 3 agents loaded the container onto a different cargo loader and moved it away from the aircraft. That's when I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. As they were wheeling the container away, I could see one of the agents covering the ventilation holes with black tape. If there were people inside that container, he had just cut off their air supply. I followed at a distance as they transported the container to a loading dock on the far side of the cargo area, near a section of the airport that I had never seen used for commercial flights. A white van was waiting with its rear doors open, and several more men in similar dark clothing were standing nearby. They loaded the container into the van quickly and efficiently, like they had done this many times before. Just before they closed the van doors, I heard it again. The desperate tapping from inside the container. But this time it was weaker, more frantic, and it was accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices calling for help. The men loading the van showed no reaction to the sounds, working with the cold efficiency of people who had learned to ignore human suffering. I tried to get closer to see the license plate on the van. But one of the agents spotted me and walked in my direction. I quickly pretended to be checking other cargo containers, but he approached me anyway. "Mr. Piper, I thought we discussed the importance of confidentiality regarding this matter." His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable threat. I was just doing my job, checking the other containers for Flight 1247. Flight 1247 has been delayed indefinitely due to mechanical issues. Your shift supervisor has been notified that you're released early tonight. I suggest you go home, get some rest, and remember that some things are better left uninvestigated. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, to call the police, but something in his eyes told me that would be a very dangerous mistake. I gathered my equipment and headed toward the employee exit, but not before memorizing as many details as possible about the men, the van, and the location where they had taken the container. The next morning, I called the FBI to report what I had witnessed. The agent who took my call listened patiently to my story, then put me on hold for several minutes. When he returned, he told me that there was no record of any federal operation at LAX the previous night, and no agents had been dispatched to investigate suspicious cargo. He took down all my information and said someone would follow up, but no one ever did. I returned to work the following night. But the cargo supervisor, Rodriguez, was gone. His replacement, a nervous man named Peterson, told me that Rodriguez had been transferred to another facility and wouldn't be returning. When I asked about the priority containers and Flight 1247, Peterson claimed to have no knowledge of either. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns I had never paid attention to before. Certain cargo containers arrived with special handling instructions that seemed to bypass normal documentation procedures. These containers always came with federal agents who supervised their loading, and they were always transported on flights that ended up being delayed or canceled at the last minute. I began keeping detailed records of these incidents, noting dates, times, container markings, and the agents involved. What I discovered was a systematic operation using commercial cargo flights as cover for human trafficking. The containers were designed to keep people alive just long enough to transport them from one location to another, but never for the full duration of an international flight. The people I had heard that night were probably dead within hours of being loaded into that van. They had managed to survive long enough to signal for help, but their rescue never came because the very people who were supposed to protect them were the ones orchestrating their disappearance. I still work the night shift at LAX, but now I understand that some cargo containers carry more than freight. They carry the desperate hopes of people who trusted the wrong promises, made the wrong deals, or simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every time I hear scratching or tapping from inside a container, I have to make an impossible choice between following orders and following my conscience. The most disturbing part isn't the trafficking operation itself, but the realization that it operates with official protection, hidden in plain sight among the millions of legitimate cargo containers that move through airports every day. Sometimes the real horror isn't supernatural or unexplained. Sometimes it's the systematic evil that thrives in the shadows of ordinary places, protected by people who have sworn to serve justice, but have chosen to serve something far more sinister instead. The radio crackled with a distress call from Flight 401 requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. The problem was that Flight 401 had crashed into the Everglades 53 years ago with no survivors. My name is Valeria, and I've been working air traffic control for Montana Regional Airport for 9 years. It's not a busy facility. We handle maybe 30 flights on a good day. Mostly small aircraft and the occasional commercial flight bound for Billings or Great Falls. The overnight shift is usually quiet, just monitoring weather conditions and handling the rare medical emergency or late arrival. I prefer the solitude of night work, the calm focus required to guide aircraft safely through the darkness, and the satisfaction of knowing that every voice on the radio represents lives, depending on my decisions. December 3rd was shaping up to be a typical winter night. A cold front had moved through earlier, leaving clear skies and temperatures hovering around 15 degrees. I had cleared 2 cargo flights and a medical transport helicopter by midnight. And the airspace was empty, except for a few military training flights parading out of Malmstrom Air Force Base, well outside my jurisdiction. I was reviewing weather reports for the morning shift when my radio suddenly came alive with a transmission that shouldn't have been possible. Montana Regional Tower, this is Eastern Airlines Flight 401, requesting immediate vectors for emergency approach. We have multiple casualties and are losing altitude rapidly. The voice was calm but urgent, with the crisp professionalism of an experienced airline captain reporting a crisis. I checked my radar display immediately. There were no aircraft within 50 miles of my airspace, and certainly no commercial flights scheduled for the next 6 hours. Eastern Airlines had ceased operations in 1991, 28 years before I was even born. I assumed it was either a radio malfunction or someone playing a sick joke on emergency frequencies. Unknown aircraft. This is Montana Regional Tower. Please identify your aircraft type, position, and souls on board. I show no traffic in the area. I kept my voice professional, following standard protocol for unidentified transmissions. Montana Tower, Eastern 401, is a Lockheed L-1011. Position approximately 15 miles southeast of your field at 4,000 feet and descending. We have 176 souls on board, including crew. We experienced catastrophic failure of multiple systems after takeoff from Miami. Request immediate clearance for runway 12. The transmission was crystal clear, without the static or distortion you'd expect from a hoax or equipment malfunction. But everything about it was impossible. Eastern Flight 401 was a real flight that had crashed in the Florida Everglades on December 29, 1972, killing 101 people when the crew became distracted troubleshooting a landing gear indicator light and flew the aircraft into the ground. I knew about the crash because it had become a famous case study in aviation safety training. More disturbing was the fact that my radar was still showing completely empty airspace. If there really was a large aircraft 15 miles southeast of the airport at 4,000 feet, it would be clearly visible on my primary and secondary radar displays. I checked all my equipment twice, ran diagnostics on the radar system, and even called Billings Approach to confirm they weren't tracking any unidentified aircraft in the area. Negative contact on any aircraft matching that description. Billings confirmed. Are you having equipment problems up there? Before I could respond, Flight 401 transmitted again. Montana Tower. We're continuing our descent. Our navigation equipment is malfunctioning and we're flying on visual reference only. We can see your airport lighting, but we're having difficulty determining wind direction and runway alignment. Can you provide current weather conditions? I was torn between following emergency procedures and the growing certainty that I was experiencing some kind of psychological episode. The voice on the radio sounded absolutely genuine. I could hear background noise that suggested a real aircraft cockpit, including the subtle hum of engines and the occasional beeping of warning systems. But my instruments were telling me that nothing was there. Flight 401. Current conditions at Montana Regional are winds 340 at 12 knots, visibility 10 miles, temperature -8 degrees Celsius, altimeter 3042. Be advised, I have no radar contact with your aircraft. Can you confirm your position and altitude? Roger, Montana Tower. We're showing 2,800 feet on our altimeter, but our instruments may be unreliable. We can see your runway lights clearly now. Requesting clearance to land runway 12. I made the decision to treat this as a real emergency. Even if I was having some kind of breakdown, the possibility that there was actually an aircraft in distress outweighed my concerns about my own mental state. I activated emergency protocols, alerting fire and rescue services and requesting ambulances on standby. Flight 401, you are cleared to land runway 12. Emergency equipment is standing by. Contact ground control on 121.9 after landing. Thank you, Montana Tower. We're grateful for your assistance. This has been a very long flight. That phrase sent chills down my spine. According to the historical records, Eastern Flight 401's captain had made similar comments during his final transmissions before the crash, describing the flight as feeling unusually long due to the extended troubleshooting of their landing gear problem. I watched my radar display intently, expecting to see the aircraft appear as it got closer to the airport. Emergency vehicles were positioning themselves along the runway, their flashing lights visible through the control tower windows. But my radar remained empty, showing no aircraft anywhere in the vicinity. Flight 401, I still have no visual or radar contact. Can you confirm you are on final approach to runway 12? Affirmative, Montana Tower. We're on final now, approximately 3 miles out. The runway lights are clearly visible and we're aligned for landing. Our passengers are secured and prepared for emergency landing procedures. I stepped outside onto the control tower's observation deck, scanning the southeastern sky for any sign of aircraft lights. The night was crystal clear, with unlimited visibility and no clouds that could obscure an approaching aircraft. I should have been able to see landing lights, navigation strobes, or any indication of a large commercial aircraft on final approach. But the sky was completely empty. Flight 401, this is Montana Tower. I need you to turn on all exterior lighting and confirm your distance from the runway threshold. All lights are on, Montana Tower. We're approximately 1 mile out and should be touching down momentarily. We want to thank you for your professionalism during this emergency. Your guidance may have saved many lives tonight. I stood on the observation deck, watching the empty runway, as Flight 401 reported touchdown. Montana Tower, Flight 401 is safely on the ground. We're clearing the runway and shutting down engines. Emergency crews can approach the aircraft. The emergency vehicles rushed toward the runway, but they found nothing. The runway was completely empty, with no signs that any aircraft had ever been there. No tire marks, no heat signatures, no physical evidence of a landing. The fire chief radioed me asking for clarification on the aircraft's location, but I had no answer to give him. Flight 401, please contact ground control for taxi instructions to the terminal. I transmitted hopefully, but there was no response. The radio frequency had gone silent, returning to the normal background static of an empty channel. I spent the rest of my shift reviewing the incident, checking and rechecking all equipment, and trying to find a rational explanation for what had happened. The airport's digital recording systems had captured every transmission from Flight 401, but when I played them back, the audio was eerily different. The background cockpit sounds were gone, replaced by a strange electronic humming that didn't sound like any aircraft I had ever heard. The next morning, I researched Eastern Flight 401 in much greater detail. What I discovered was that the crew had been trying to reach Miami International Airport when they crashed, but their navigation equipment had malfunctioned, leaving them confused about their exact position and altitude. The captain had been requesting vectors and emergency landing clearance when the aircraft flew into the ground at 227 miles per hour. More disturbing was the discovery that other air traffic controllers had reported similar incidents over the years. Always on December 3rd, always involving Flight 401, and always requesting emergency landing clearance at airports across the country. The transmissions were always recorded, but radar never showed any corresponding aircraft, and no physical evidence of the flights was ever found. I learned that December 3rd was significant because it was exactly 3 weeks before the anniversary of the crash. Aviation psychologists theorized that the crew might be trapped in some kind of temporal loop, endlessly repeating their final flight and trying to find a safe place to land. Each transmission represented their ongoing attempt to save the lives they had lost 53 years ago. I continued working air traffic control, but I was never quite the same after that night. Every December 3rd, I volunteered for the overnight shift, waiting to hear from Flight 401 again. Sometimes they called, sometimes they didn't. But when they did, I always provided the same professional service, guiding them through their eternal emergency with the same care I would show any aircraft in distress. The most unsettling part wasn't the impossibility of the situation, but the realization that some emergencies never end. Somewhere in the radio waves that connect aircraft to the ground, Flight 401 is still flying, still requesting emergency landing clearance, still trying to save lives that were lost decades ago. And controllers like me are still there to help them, even knowing that no landing will ever bring them peace. The bloody handprint inside the engine intake was still warm when I found it during my 3 a.m. inspection. What made it impossible was that security footage showed the hangar had been empty all night, and the engine had been running just 6 hours earlier. I'm Arya, and I've been a licensed aircraft maintenance technician for Delta Airlines for 14 years. My specialty is turbofan engine inspection and repair, which means I spend most of my time crawling inside some of the most powerful and dangerous machinery ever built. A single mistake during maintenance can kill hundreds of people, so we follow strict protocols for every inspection, every repair, every component replacement. The night shift at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson is where the real work happens. While passengers sleep and dream about their destinations, we're making sure their aircraft won't become their coffins. November 18th started with a routine maintenance check on a Boeing 757 that had just completed a round-trip flight to Phoenix. The aircraft had logged 847 flight hours since its last major inspection, and company policy required a detailed engine examination before it could return to service. The left engine had been reporting slightly elevated temperatures during climb-out, which usually indicates minor turbine blade wear or debris buildup in the compressor section. I was working alone in Hangar 7, which isn't unusual for overnight maintenance shifts. The hangar was nearly silent, except for the hum of industrial lighting and the distant sound of ground equipment from the active ramp areas. I had completed the external inspection of both engines and was preparing to remove the intake cowling from the left power plant when I noticed something that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like standard maintenance markings, the kind of grease pencil notations that mechanics use to indicate inspection points or component serial numbers. But when I shone my flashlight directly on the engine intake, I realized I was looking at something much more disturbing. There were handprints on the inner surface of the intake cone, clearly visible against the polished metal surface. Handprints inside an engine intake are impossible under normal circumstances. The intake cone is located deep within the engine's air inlet, and accessing it requires specialized tools and safety procedures. More importantly, these handprints appeared to be made with blood, not grease or hydraulic fluid. The prints were dark red, with clear finger ridges and palm patterns that suggested they had been pressed against the metal surface with considerable force. I immediately shut down all hangar lighting and contacted security. Company protocol requires that any evidence of sabotage or tampering be reported immediately, and bloodstains definitely qualified as suspicious circumstances. While waiting for the security supervisor, I used my portable LED work light to examine the prints more carefully. What I saw made my stomach turn. These weren't just random smears or accidental contact marks. Someone had deliberately placed both hands against the inside surface of the engine intake, pressing hard enough to leave detailed fingerprints in what appeared to be fresh blood. The prints were positioned as if someone had been trying to climb out of the engine from the inside, clawing desperately at the smooth metal walls. Security Supervisor Jenkins arrived within 10 minutes, accompanied by 2 airport police officers and a crime scene photographer. They examined the evidence carefully, taking detailed photographs and measurements of the handprints. What they found was even more disturbing than I had initially realized. "These prints are still warm," Jenkins said, using an infrared thermometer to check the surface temperature. "Whatever happened here occurred within the last few hours." He looked at me with a concerned expression. "You're certain this aircraft hasn't been operated since it arrived from Phoenix?" I checked the maintenance log again. The aircraft shut down at 9:47 p.m. after arriving on Flight 1832. The engines have been cold since then. Nobody has accessed this hangar except me, and I've been here since 2 a.m. Officer Martinez was examining the security footage on a portable monitor. "We're showing continuous coverage of this hangar from 6 p.m. tonight until now. Nobody entered or exited, except for you at 2:03 a.m. The hangar has been secured and empty for the past 5 hours." That's when Jenkins made a discovery that changed everything. Using a high-powered flashlight, he found additional evidence deeper inside the engine. There are more handprints further back, near the compressor inlet, and what looks like fabric fragments caught on the compressor blades. The fabric was dark blue, consistent with standard airline employee uniforms. Crime scene techs carefully extracted several pieces, including what appeared to be part of a name tag, with partial lettering that read, "OMAS D." The fabric showed signs of extreme heat damage and tearing that suggested violent contact with rotating machinery. "We need to check employee records for anyone named Thomas," Martinez said. "And we need to review the passenger manifest and crew roster for Flight 1832. The investigation revealed something that made everyone involved question the evidence of their own eyes. Flight 1832's crew roster included First Officer David Thomas, a 15-year veteran with an exemplary safety record. But according to the flight crew, Thomas had completed the flight normally, gone through standard post-flight procedures, and left the airport at approximately 10:30 p.m. to drive home to his apartment in Marietta. More disturbing was the discovery that David Thomas had been found dead in his apartment at 11:15 p.m., apparently from a massive heart attack. The medical examiner estimated time of death at approximately 10:45 p.m., which was 15 minutes after he had left the airport and more than 4 hours before I had discovered the handprints in the engine. "Let me understand this correctly," Detective Rodriguez said during his interview with me the next morning. "You found fresh blood evidence suggesting that someone was inside an engine that hadn't been running for over 5 hours, and that someone appears to be a pilot who died of natural causes at home 4 hours before you made the discovery." I nodded, knowing how insane it sounded. "The handprints were warm, Detective. The blood was still tacky to the touch. Whatever happened in that engine occurred recently, not hours ago." The investigation continued for 3 days, with federal aviation authorities joining local police in trying to explain the physical evidence. The DNA analysis of the blood came back as a positive match for David Thomas, confirming that it was his blood inside the engine. But toxicology reports showed no evidence of trauma or foul play in his death. He had simply suffered a massive cardiac event while sitting in his living room chair. The fabric analysis was even more puzzling. The pieces recovered from the engine compressor matched Thomas's uniform shirt. But the shirt he was wearing when his body was discovered was intact and showed no signs of damage or missing fabric. It was as if 2 versions of the same shirt existed simultaneously. "I've been investigating aviation accidents for 22 years, Federal Aviation Inspector Hawkins told me. "I've seen mechanical failures, pilot error, sabotage, and weather-related crashes. But I've never encountered physical evidence that suggests someone was inside an engine after they were already dead." The official report classified the incident as unexplained physical evidence with no safety implications for aircraft operations. The engine was completely disassembled, inspected, and rebuilt with new components before being returned to service. But the investigators never found a rational explanation for how David Thomas's blood and uniform fragments had appeared inside an engine that hadn't been running since before his death. I continued working night maintenance shifts, but I started paying attention to details I had never noticed before. Engines that had been shut down for hours sometimes showed signs of recent heat buildup. Aircraft that had been secured and empty overnight occasionally contained personal items that hadn't been there during pre-shift inspections. Most disturbing were the maintenance logs that sometimes contained entries in handwriting I didn't recognize, documenting work that had never been performed. 6 months later, I learned about similar incidents at other maintenance facilities across the country, always involving recently deceased airline personnel, always discovered during overnight shifts, and always leaving behind physical evidence that contradicted the timeline of events. The common factor was that the deceased individuals had all died suddenly while off duty, often from heart attacks or other medical emergencies. Aviation psychologists theorized that some airline personnel become so emotionally connected to their aircraft that death doesn't immediately sever their sense of professional responsibility. They continue trying to perform their duties, inspecting engines, checking systems, and ensuring aircraft safety even after their physical bodies have stopped functioning. I still work the night shift, still perform detailed engine inspections, and still find evidence that defies logical explanation. Sometimes it's handprints in impossible locations. Sometimes it's tools arranged in patterns that suggest recent use. And sometimes it's just the feeling that someone else is in the hangar with me, continuing their work in the shadows between life and death. The most disturbing realization isn't that dead airline personnel continue working after death, but that their dedication to safety extends beyond the grave. They're still trying to protect passengers, still performing inspections, still maintaining the aircraft they served in life. In an industry where human error can cause mass casualties, perhaps some professionals are simply too committed to their responsibilities to let death interfere with their duties. The elderly woman in 13F had boarded at every single stop on our cross-country red-eye, but her name never appeared on any passenger manifest. She kept whispering about crashes that hadn't happened yet, and her boarding pass was dated 37 years in the future. I'm Adeline, and I've been a senior flight attendant with American Airlines for 19 years. I've worked every type of route imaginable: short domestic hops, international long hauls, charter flights, and the dreaded red-eye runs that most crew members try to avoid. There's something uniquely challenging about overnight flights. Passengers are irritable, cabin service is minimal, and you're fighting your own circadian rhythms while trying to maintain professional composure. But the red-eyes pay well, and after nearly 2 decades in the industry, I thought I had seen every possible passenger situation. Flight 2847 from Los Angeles to Boston was scheduled as a multi-stop overnight service, with brief stops in Phoenix, Denver, and Chicago. It's not a popular routing. Most passengers prefer direct flights. But it serves smaller markets and provides connectivity for travelers willing to sacrifice convenience for lower fares. The October 31st departure was typical for this route, with maybe 60 passengers spread across a 737 configured for 149 seats. Our first unusual passenger boarded in Los Angeles during the initial boarding process. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a dark blue traveling suit that looked like it belonged in the 1980s. She moved slowly down the aisle with the careful precision of someone who had flown extensively, but was no longer confident about navigating crowded aircraft. What caught my attention was her seat selection. She had chosen 13F, a window seat in what's traditionally considered an unlucky row. Most airlines skip row 13 entirely due to superstitious passengers, but American still includes it on older aircraft configurations. The woman settled into her seat quietly, declining beverages or reading materials, and spent most of the flight to Phoenix staring out the window, with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. When we landed in Phoenix for our scheduled 40-minute stop, I watched carefully as passengers deplaned for the brief layover. Some were continuing to Boston, others were ending their journey in Phoenix, and a few new passengers would be boarding for the next segment. The elderly woman in 13F gathered her small handbag and deplaned along with everyone else, moving through the jet bridge with the same careful, deliberate steps she had used during boarding. During the Phoenix boarding process, I was busy with cabin preparations and passenger assistance. But I noticed the same elderly woman walking down the aisle toward her seat. She was wearing the identical dark blue suit, carrying the same small handbag, and she moved with the exact same careful precision I had observed in Los Angeles. She settled into seat 13F as if she had never left. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her seat with my most professional smile. "I believe I saw you deplane in Phoenix. Are you continuing with us to Boston?" She looked up at me with pale blue eyes that seemed strangely familiar, though I was certain I had never met her before. "Yes, dear. I always fly this route. It's important that I complete the journey." I checked my passenger manifest on the electronic tablet, but there was no record of anyone assigned to seat 13F for the Phoenix to Denver segment. The seat showed as available, which should have been impossible if she had a valid boarding pass. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass? I want to make sure your seat assignment is correct." She handed me a standard American Airlines boarding pass. But when I examined it closely, something was very wrong. The flight number was correct, AA28847, but the date printed on the pass was October 31st, 2062. The boarding pass was dated 37 years in the future. "I think there might be an error with your boarding pass," I said carefully. "The date seems to be incorrect." "Oh, that," she said with a gentle smile. "Time moves differently when you're trying to prevent something terrible. The important thing is that I'm here to help." Before I could ask her to clarify what she meant, other passengers were settling into their seats and we were preparing for departure to Denver. I made a mental note to discuss the situation with the gate agent in Denver. But for now, seat 13F was empty, according to our records, and the woman seemed harmless enough. During the flight to Denver, I found myself checking on her frequently. She spent the entire segment staring out the window, occasionally writing notes in a small leather journal with handwriting that looked remarkably old-fashioned. When I offered her beverages or snacks, she politely declined, saying she was watching for weather patterns. "Are you a meteorologist?" I asked during one of my checks. "Not exactly, dear, but I've learned to recognize the signs. There's going to be severe turbulence over the Rockies tonight, worse than the forecast indicates. The captain should consider requesting a more southerly route." I thanked her for the information, but our weather radar wasn't showing any significant activity ahead, and air traffic control hadn't issued any turbulence advisories. Still, something about her quiet confidence made me mention her concerns to Captain Morrison during my next cockpit visit. "Passenger weather advice?" He chuckled. "Well, we're always happy to listen to input, but our meteorological data looks fine for the planned route." 20 minutes later, we encountered the worst turbulence I had experienced in my 19-year career. The aircraft was thrown violently up and down, passengers were screaming, and several people were injured when the seatbelt sign came on too late to prevent them from being thrown around the cabin. Captain Morrison immediately requested vectors to avoid the weather, and we spent an additional 40 minutes navigating around storm cells that hadn't appeared on any weather radar. When I checked on the elderly woman during the turbulence, she was sitting calmly in seat 13F with her seatbelt fastened, showing no signs of fear or distress. "It should smooth out in about 6 minutes," she told me. "The worst cell is passing to our north now." Exactly 6 minutes later, the turbulence ended and we returned to smooth flight conditions. We landed in Denver 43 minutes behind schedule due to the weather delay. Once again, I watched as the elderly woman deplaned with all the other passengers, moving through the jet bridge with her characteristic careful steps. And once again, during the Denver boarding process, she appeared in the aisle and settled into seat 13F for the next segment to Chicago. This time, I was prepared. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your travel arrangements. You've been boarding this flight at every stop, but your seat doesn't appear on our manifest, and your boarding pass has an impossible date." She looked at me with those pale blue eyes and said, "Adeline Marie Chen, employee number 47382, hired by American Airlines on March 15th, 2006. You've been working flight 2847 on Halloween night for the past 4 years, haven't you?" I felt cold chills run down my spine. She knew my full name, my employee number, and details about my work history that weren't public information. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been flying this route for 37 years, trying to prevent what happened on November 1st, 1987. Flight 2847 from Los Angeles to Boston. Same route, same schedule, same flight number. It crashed during approach to Logan Airport, killing all 157 passengers and crew." I checked our historical flight database on my tablet. There had indeed been a crash involving Flight 2847 on November 1987. But the details were different from what she described. According to the records, the aircraft had encountered severe icing conditions and crashed short of the runway. But there had been only 89 people on board, not 157. "The official records are incomplete," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "They never found all the bodies, and some passengers weren't properly manifested. But I remember every name, every face, every person who died that night." "Who are you?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect an answer I didn't want to hear. "I'm Margaret Walsh, senior flight attendant, employee number 23156. I worked this route for 12 years before the crash. I've been trying to save the passengers ever since. But I can only influence small things: weather warnings, seating changes, minor delays that might prevent the chain of events that led to the accident." I looked up employee number 23156 in the historical database. Margaret Walsh had indeed been a senior flight attendant, killed in the 1987 crash of Flight 2847. Her photograph showed a younger version of the woman sitting in seat 13F, with the same pale blue eyes and gentle smile. For the remainder of the flight to Chicago and then to Boston, Margaret continued her vigil, offering subtle warnings about weather conditions, suggesting small changes to our approach procedures, and providing information that helped us avoid several potential safety issues. She never tried to frighten passengers or cause panic, but worked quietly to influence events in ways that might prevent history from repeating itself. When we finally landed safely in Boston at 6:43 a.m., 37 minutes behind schedule due to weather delays and route changes, Margaret smiled at me one final time. "Thank you for listening, dear. Every safe landing is a small victory." She deplaned in Boston along with all the other passengers. But this time, she didn't return. I watched through the terminal windows as she walked slowly through the gate area, her figure becoming fainter with each step until she simply faded away in the early morning light. I've continued working the red-eye routes, including Flight 2847, but Margaret never returned. Perhaps she finally accomplished what she had been trying to do for 37 years, or perhaps her influence was only needed for that one night. Either way, I learned that some passengers carry more than luggage when they board our flights. They carry the weight of unfinished business, the determination to protect others from suffering the same fate they endured. and the quiet courage to keep trying even when success seems impossible. The figure siphoning fuel from the 777 left no footprints in the fresh snow, but my truck's gauges showed 3,000 gallons missing. When I got closer with my flashlight, the person vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the smell of jet fuel and something that might have been sulfur. My name is Everly, and I've been driving fuel trucks at Denver International Airport for 11 years. It's specialized work that requires hazmat certification, security clearance, and the kind of steady nerves that come from handling highly explosive materials around multi-million-dollar aircraft. The overnight shift pays a premium because most fuel deliveries happen during aircraft turnaround periods when passengers aren't boarding, and the reduced air traffic allows for safer ground operations. I've always found something meditative about the work, the precise calculations, the careful connections, the knowledge that every gallon I pump might be the difference between a safe flight and an empty tank over the Rocky Mountains. January 14th brought the kind of blizzard that shuts down most of Colorado. By 2 a.m., the airport was operating at minimal capacity with only essential flights maintaining schedules. The snowfall was so heavy that ground crews could barely keep the runways clear, and visibility was reduced to less than a quarter mile. I was assigned to fuel 3 aircraft that were scheduled for early morning departures once the storm passed. A United 737 bound for Chicago, an American 757 headed to Frankfurt, and a Southwest flight that would eventually make its way to Phoenix. The American 757 was parked at Gate A23, isolated from the main terminal complex due to ongoing construction work. It was a newer aircraft, capable of carrying nearly 300 passengers and requiring approximately 47,000 gallons of fuel for the transatlantic flight to Germany. The fueling process for a wide-body aircraft is complex and time-consuming, involving multiple connections, pressure checks, and safety protocols that can't be rushed regardless of weather conditions. I had completed fueling the United 737 without incident and was making my way across the tarmac to the 777 when I noticed something unusual through the swirling snow. There appeared to be someone near the aircraft's fuel ports, but no other ground personnel were scheduled to be working in that area. Airport security protocols require that fuel trucks be accompanied by certified personnel during all operations, and unauthorized individuals near fuel systems represent both security and safety risks. As I drove closer, I could make out a figure in what looked like standard airport ground crew clothing, dark coveralls, and a reflective vest. The person was working methodically around the aircraft's fuel system, but something about their movements seemed wrong. They were too fluid, too precise, like someone who had performed the same actions thousands of times without ever having to think about the individual steps. I parked my fuel truck about 50 feet away and activated the emergency flashers, following standard protocol for approaching an unknown situation involving fuel systems. The figure appeared to be connecting some kind of equipment to the aircraft's fuel ports, but I couldn't identify the machinery from a distance. More concerning was the fact that I could see fuel flowing from the aircraft, creating a stream that should have been clearly visible in the snow, but somehow wasn't leaving any trace on the ground. "Hey," I called out, stepping down from the cab of my truck. "You're not authorized to be working on that aircraft." The figure straightened up and turned toward me, but even with my high-powered work lights illuminated, I couldn't make out any facial features. The person seemed to be wearing some kind of hood or mask that obscured their identity completely. They raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then returned to their work as if I wasn't there. I grabbed my radio to contact airport security, but the device was producing nothing but static and electronic interference. The storm shouldn't have been affecting communications equipment. And my radio had been working perfectly just 20 minutes earlier during my check-in with dispatch. I tried my cell phone and found the same problem. No signal, no data connection, just dead silence, where there should have been network coverage. With no way to call for backup, I decided to approach the figure directly. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from my truck and walked carefully across the tarmac, trying to avoid slipping on the accumulating snow and ice. As I got closer, I could hear the sound of fuel flowing and pumping equipment operating, but it didn't sound like any machinery I was familiar with. The noise was too smooth, too rhythmic, almost like breathing. When I was about 20 feet away, I shone my flashlight directly at the figure and called out again. "Sir, you need to step away from that aircraft immediately. You're in violation of federal aviation security regulations." That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The person was indeed draining fuel from the 777, but the fuel wasn't pooling on the ground or flowing into any visible container. It was simply disappearing, vanishing into the air, as if it was being consumed by something I couldn't see. More disturbing was the fact that despite walking through fresh snow that was already several inches deep, the figure had left no footprints leading to or around the aircraft. I looked back at my own path and could clearly see the deep impressions my boots had made in the snow, along with the tire tracks from my fuel truck. But the area around the aircraft showed no sign that anyone had been walking there. It was as if the figure was floating above the ground, working on the fuel system without ever making physical contact with the tarmac. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the wind and snow. "What are you doing to that aircraft?" The figure turned toward me again, and this time I got a better look at what I was dealing with. It definitely wasn't human. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with movements that suggested joints bending in directions that human anatomy doesn't allow. The face was completely obscured by what I had initially thought was a hood, but now realized was simply an absence of features, like looking into a void shaped roughly like a human head. I fumbled for my flashlight's high-intensity setting and hit the figure with a full 3,000 lumen beam. The light passed right through whatever I was looking at, creating no shadow and apparently causing no discomfort or reaction. The thing continued working on the fuel system as if I wasn't there, as if my presence was no more significant than the falling snow. That's when I noticed my fuel truck's gauges. When I had parked 50 feet away, my tanks were showing 8,847 gallons of Jet A fuel remaining after the United 737 fueling operation. Now the gauges were reading 5,761 gallons, meaning that somehow over 3,000 gallons had disappeared from my truck without any visible transfer lines or pumping operations. I ran back to my truck and tried the engine, desperate to get away from whatever was happening near the 777. The diesel engine turned over, but wouldn't start, even though it had been running perfectly when I parked. All my electrical systems were functioning, but something was preventing the engine from firing. I was stranded in a blizzard with a non-human entity that was apparently stealing fuel through some method that defied physical laws. Looking back at the aircraft, I could see that the figure had finished whatever it was doing and was moving away from the 777. But instead of walking, it seemed to be dissolving into the storm, becoming less solid with each step until it was indistinguishable from the swirling snow. Within moments, there was no sign that anything had ever been there. My truck's engine started immediately once the figure disappeared, and my radio crackled back to life with normal airport communications traffic. I contacted security and reported the incident. But by the time they arrived at Gate A23, the only evidence was the missing fuel from my truck and a strong smell of jet fuel mixed with something else. something that reminded me of sulfur or burning electrical components. The 777 was thoroughly inspected before its scheduled departure, and maintenance crews found that all fuel systems were intact and functioning normally. However, the aircraft's fuel quantity sensors showed readings that were inconsistent with the amount of fuel that should have been in the tanks based on the previous evening's servicing. The discrepancy matched almost exactly the amount of fuel that had disappeared from my truck. Investigation revealed that similar incidents had been reported at airports across the country over the past several years. Always during severe weather conditions, always involving unexplained fuel disappearances, and always witnessed by a single ground crew member working alone. The common factor was that the affected aircraft were all wide-body jets scheduled for long-haul flights, suggesting that whatever was taking the fuel had a preference for high-capacity fuel systems. Aviation security specialists theorized that the incidents might be related to some kind of advanced fuel theft operation using technology that current detection systems couldn't identify. But the witnesses all described the same impossible characteristics: figures that left no footprints, equipment that transferred fuel without visible connections, and entities that seemed to exist partially outside normal physical constraints. I continued working fuel truck operations, but I started carrying additional detection equipment and maintaining constant radio contact with dispatch during overnight shifts. The entity never returned, at least not when I was present. But other drivers reported similar encounters during severe weather conditions. We learned to work in pairs during storms, and fuel disappearances dropped significantly once we implemented buddy system protocols. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the fuel theft itself, but the realization that something non-human was operating within airport security perimeters, using methods that suggested technology far beyond current human capabilities. Whether it was extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something else entirely, it had developed an interest in aviation fuel that posed potential risks to flight safety. The thought that passenger aircraft might be taking off with insufficient fuel due to these mysterious disappearances added a layer of anxiety to every fueling operation I performed. The suitcase in Carousel 7 was bleeding through its leather seams, leaving dark stains on the conveyor belt. Inside, I found fresh surgical instruments and a handwritten note warning about Dr. Reese, who harvests organs from sleeping passengers at 30,000 feet. I'm Genevieve, and I've worked baggage handling at Chicago O'Hare for 8 years. People think our job is just throwing suitcases around. But there's a science to it. Weight distribution, fragile item protocols, security screening procedures, and the constant vigilance required to spot suspicious packages that could endanger aircraft and passengers. The overnight shift handles connecting flights from the West Coast, red-eye arrivals, and international cargo that needs processing before morning departures. It's demanding work that requires attention to detail, because one mishandled bag can mean the difference between a passenger making their connection and missing a crucial business meeting or family emergency. February 2nd started as a typical Thursday night, with moderate traffic from delayed flights trying to make up time after weather issues on the West Coast. I was working the international baggage sorting area, processing luggage from a Lufthansa flight that had arrived from Munich with connections to smaller Midwest cities. The German flight had been delayed 3 hours due to mechanical issues, which meant passengers were scrambling to make their connecting flights, and we were under pressure to expedite baggage transfers. Most international luggage goes through additional security screening, especially bags that weren't pre-screened at their origin airports. The process involves X-ray examination, random physical inspections, and documentation checks to ensure nothing dangerous or illegal enters the domestic transportation system. I had processed about 200 bags without incident when I noticed something unusual about a medium-sized burgundy leather suitcase moving along Carousel 7. At first, it looked like standard wear and tear from international travel. Scuff marks, slightly damaged corners, and the general deterioration that expensive luggage develops after multiple trips through various airport handling systems. But as the suitcase moved past my station, I noticed dark stains seeping through the leather seams, creating wet spots that hadn't been there during initial inspection. I stopped the conveyor belt and approached the suitcase for closer examination. The stains were dark red and had a metallic smell that I recognized from previous experience, with damaged luggage containing broken bottles or food items. But this odor was different, more organic, more unsettling. It reminded me of the smell in hospital emergency rooms, a combination of antiseptic and something much more disturbing. The baggage tag showed passenger named J. Morrison, with a connecting flight to Des Moines scheduled to depart at 6:47 a.m. The tag had been properly processed through German customs and showed no unusual routing or handling instructions. But when I lifted the suitcase to move it to an inspection area, it felt wrong. Not just heavy, but unbalanced in a way that suggested liquid contents that could shift around inside. Following security protocols, I contacted TSA Supervisor Williams to request emergency inspection of suspicious baggage. While waiting for him to arrive, I noticed that the stains were spreading, creating a small puddle beneath the suitcase that was definitely not normal wear and tear. Whatever was inside that bag was fresh, organic, and leaking through supposedly waterproof leather construction. Williams arrived within 6 minutes, equipped with portable X-ray equipment and chemical detection devices used for identifying hazardous materials. His initial scan showed unusual density patterns inside the suitcase, with objects that appeared metallic mixed with organic materials of varying composition. The chemical detector registered positive results for several compounds typically associated with medical environments. "We need to open this immediately," Williams said, pulling on protective gloves and preparing sterilized cutting tools. The chemical readings suggest biological materials that could pose health risks. The suitcase wasn't locked, which struck me as odd for international travel containing valuable items. Williams carefully opened the latches and lifted the lid, revealing contents that made both of us step back in shock. The interior was lined with medical-grade plastic sheeting, and it contained what appeared to be a complete set of surgical instruments, along with several sealed containers holding what looked like human tissue specimens. But the most disturbing discovery was a handwritten note placed prominently on top of the surgical tools. Written in precise block letters, it read, "Warning, Dr. Jamie Reese, seat 14A on connecting flights, harvests organs from sedated passengers during overnight flights, operates with accomplice flight attendant Princeton Rhodes. Victims selected based on blood type compatibility. Evidence collection in progress. Contact FBI immediately." Williams immediately called federal authorities while I secured the area and documented the scene with photographs. The surgical instruments appeared to be high-quality medical equipment, including scalpels, clamps, sutures, and specialized tools used in organ transplant procedures. The tissue containers were labeled with blood type information and dates suggesting recent collection. "We need passenger manifests for all connecting flights involving anyone named Jamie Reese or Princeton Rhodes," FBI agent Martinez said when she arrived 30 minutes later. "And we need to identify the owner of this suitcase immediately." The investigation revealed disturbing information about both individuals mentioned in the warning note. Dr. Jamie Reese was indeed a licensed surgeon who frequently traveled on red-eye flights, ostensibly for medical conferences and consultation work. Princeton Rhodes was a flight attendant with American Airlines who had worked multiple routes involving Dr. Reese's travel schedule over the past 18 months. More alarming was the discovery that several passengers on flights where both individuals were present had reported feeling unusually drowsy during overnight flights, with some experiencing memory gaps and unexplained soreness in their abdominal areas. Medical examinations of these passengers revealed small incision scars that were consistent with laparoscopic surgical procedures. The passenger listed as J. Morrison doesn't exist, Agent Martinez informed me during her follow-up interview. The passport and identification documents associated with that baggage tag are sophisticated forgeries. Someone went to considerable trouble to get this evidence into the transportation system where it would be discovered. The tissue samples in the suitcase were analyzed and found to contain genetic material from 5 different individuals, all of whom had been passengers on flights where Dr. Reese and Princeton Rhodes were present. The surgical instruments contained trace amounts of sedative drugs typically used in anesthesiology, along with DNA evidence linking them to the same passengers. Federal authorities arrested both Dr. Reese and Princeton Rhodes based on the evidence found in the mysterious suitcase. The investigation revealed an extensive organ trafficking network that had been operating for over 2 years, using commercial flights as mobile surgical facilities, where unconscious passengers were subjected to tissue and organ harvesting procedures during overnight flights. The perpetrators would identify passengers with rare blood types or compatible tissue markers through airline medical information databases, Agent Martinez explained. They would then arrange to be on the same flights, sedate selected victims during meal service, perform surgical procedures in aircraft lavatories modified with portable medical equipment, and complete the operations before landing. The harvested organs were sold through international black market networks, with buyers arranged in advance and transactions coordinated through encrypted communication systems. The victims were left with no memory of the procedures due to the amnesia-inducing drugs used during the operations, and most attributed their post-flight discomfort to jet lag or airplane food. What remained unexplained was the identity of the person who had assembled the evidence and arranged for its discovery through the baggage handling system. The sophistication of the operation suggested insider knowledge of both the organ trafficking network and airport security procedures. The mysterious whistleblower had managed to collect incriminating evidence, create false documentation, and ensure the suitcase would be discovered during routine security screening. Someone with access to medical facilities, airline operations, and federal identification systems put this evidence package together, Agent Martinez said. But we may never know who it was, and frankly, we're grateful they did. The case led to enhanced security screening for medical equipment on commercial flights and new protocols for monitoring passenger medical distress during overnight flights. But it also revealed how commercial aviation systems could be exploited by criminal organizations willing to use the enclosed, isolated environment of aircraft for illegal activities that would be impossible to conduct in traditional ground-based facilities. I continued working baggage handling, but with a new understanding of how luggage could contain evidence of crimes that occurred thousands of miles away and tens of thousands of feet above the ground. Every suspicious stain, every unusual odor, every bag that felt wrong became a potential indicator of criminal activity that extended far beyond simple customs violations or contraband smuggling. The most unsettling realization was that passenger aircraft, with their captive audiences and limited escape options, could serve as perfect venues for criminal activities that relied on victim isolation and the inability to seek immediate help. The thought that medical procedures were being performed on unconscious passengers in aircraft lavatories added a new dimension of horror to the routine experience of commercial air travel. The passengers screaming silently behind the aircraft windows shouldn't have been there because the flight manifest showed the plane was empty, but I could see their terrified faces pressed against the glass, all pointing frantically at the ice formations I was supposed to remove. I'm Anastasia, and I've been working aircraft de-icing operations at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport for 7 years. It's specialized work that requires certification in chemical handling, aircraft systems knowledge, and the ability to work in extreme weather conditions that would shut down most other airport operations. Minnesota winters are brutal, with temperatures dropping to -30 and wind chills that can kill exposed skin in minutes. But aircraft still need to fly, and that means someone has to climb into a bucket lift at 4 in the morning to spray heated glycol solution on wing surfaces and engine intakes, while blizzards rage around them. March 8th brought one of the worst late-season storms I had ever worked in. The temperature was hovering at -18 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting up to 45 miles per hour and snow falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to less than 50 feet. Most airlines had canceled their morning departures. But Northwest Flight 255 was scheduled to attempt takeoff at 6:30 a.m. once the storm passed. And company policy required that the aircraft be de-iced within 1 hour of departure, regardless of weather conditions. The Boeing 727 was parked at Gate G14, isolated from the main terminal due to ongoing runway construction. It was an older aircraft that Northwest used primarily for cargo operations and charter flights, though this particular flight was listed as a passenger service to Detroit with connections to several East Coast destinations. The aircraft had been sitting overnight in accumulating snow and ice, requiring a complete de-icing treatment of all flight surfaces before it could safely attempt takeoff. I was working alone in the de-icing truck, which isn't unusual for overnight operations when staffing is reduced due to weather conditions. The truck's heated cab provided protection from the wind and snow, but the actual de-icing work required me to operate the boom arm and spray equipment while exposed to the full force of the storm. The glycol solution had to be heated to specific temperatures and applied in precise patterns to ensure complete ice removal without damaging aircraft surfaces. As I positioned the truck near the 727's starboard wing, I noticed something unusual about the aircraft's interior lighting. Most empty aircraft are kept in minimal power mode overnight, with only essential systems activated and cabin lighting turned off to conserve battery power. But Flight 255 had most of its cabin lights on, and I could see movement through the passenger windows that suggested people were on board. I checked my work order again to confirm the aircraft's status. According to the de-icing request, Flight 255 was an empty positioning flight that would pick up passengers in Detroit for the continuation to Washington, D.C. There should have been only the flight crew on board, and they would normally be in the cockpit completing pre-flight preparations rather than moving around the passenger cabin. I extended the boom arm to begin de-icing the wing surface when I got a clear view through the aircraft's windows. What I saw made me stop the glycol flow immediately and stare in disbelief. The passenger cabin was full of people, but they weren't sitting in their seats normally. They were all pressed against the windows, looking out at me with expressions of absolute terror. Their mouths open as if they were screaming, though I couldn't hear any sound through the aircraft's insulation. Every visible passenger was pointing frantically at something on the wing's surface, gesturing urgently as if trying to warn me about a critical safety issue. Their faces showed pure panic, the kind of expression people have when they know they're about to die, and there's nothing they can do to prevent it. Men, women, children, all pressed against the windows in desperate attempts to communicate something vital. I aimed my work lights at the wing surface they were pointing toward, and immediately saw what had them terrified. The ice formation on the wing wasn't normal. Instead of the typical uniform coating that develops during overnight exposure, The ice had formed in patterns that looked almost organic, like crystalline growths that resembled branching blood vessels or neural networks. The formations were concentrated around the wing's fuel tanks and extended toward the engine mounting points in ways that could interfere with critical flight systems. More disturbing was the fact that the ice formations appeared to be moving, growing, and shifting even as I watched. Ice doesn't behave that way under normal conditions. It forms gradually and remains static until removed by heat or mechanical action. But these crystalline structures were actively expanding, creating new branches and connections that threatened to penetrate the aircraft's fuel lines and control cables. I immediately radioed the Airport Operations Center to report unsafe ice conditions on Flight 255. But my radio produced only static and electronic interference. The storm shouldn't have been affecting communications equipment, and my radio had been working perfectly during my earlier check-in with dispatch. I tried my cell phone and found the same problem. No signal, no data connection, just dead silence where there should have been network coverage. With no way to contact ground control, I decided to approach the aircraft directly to warn the flight crew about the dangerous ice formations. I climbed down from the de-icing truck and walked carefully across the tarmac, fighting against wind gusts that threatened to knock me over. As I got closer to the 727, I could see the passengers more clearly through the windows, and what I saw defied rational explanation. The people inside the aircraft were wearing clothing styles from different decades: 1970s business suits, 1980s casual wear, 1990s fashion trends. It was as if passengers from multiple flights spanning 20 years had somehow been combined in a single aircraft. But they were all exhibiting the same behavior, pointing at the wing formations and trying desperately to communicate warnings about the ice conditions. When I reached the aircraft's boarding door, I pounded on the metal surface and shouted for the flight crew. The door was locked from the inside, which is standard security procedure. But I could hear sounds from within the aircraft that didn't match normal pre-flight activities. Instead of the usual crew communications and equipment checks, I could hear what sounded like dozens of voices calling out in distress, overlapping conversations in multiple languages, and the general cacophony of panic. I walked around to the cockpit windows and tried to get the attention of the flight crew. But the cockpit appeared to be empty. The pilot and co-pilot seats were vacant, and none of the instrument panels showed the normal activity patterns of pre-flight preparation. Yet the aircraft's engines were spooling up as if someone was preparing for departure, and I could see exhaust heat shimmers that indicated the power plants were approaching operational temperatures. That's when I realized what the passengers had been trying to warn me about. The ice formations on the wings weren't just unusual. They were designed to look normal from a distance, while concealing critical structural damage underneath. When the aircraft attempted takeoff, the hidden damage would cause catastrophic failure during the most dangerous phase of flight, when recovery would be impossible. I ran back to my de-icing truck and began applying heated glycol solution to the wing surfaces as quickly as possible, trying to remove not just the ice, but the crystalline formations that were masking the underlying damage. As the ice melted away, I could see that the wing structure had been compromised by what appeared to be deliberate sabotage. Control cables had been severed, fuel lines had been punctured, and hydraulic systems had been disabled in ways that would only become apparent during flight operations. The heated glycol was working, dissolving the ice formations and revealing the extent of the sabotage. But as the ice disappeared, so did the passengers in the aircraft windows. One by one, their terrified faces faded away until the cabin was empty and dark, showing no signs that anyone had ever been on board. The aircraft's engines wound down to idle, and normal pre-flight lighting patterns resumed as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. By the time airport security arrived to investigate my reports of sabotage, Flight 255 showed no evidence of structural damage or unusual ice formations. The aircraft passed all safety inspections and was cleared for departure on schedule. But the maintenance crew found something that validated my experience: traces of chemicals in the ice formations that were consistent with sabotage materials and tool marks on wing components that suggested recent tampering. The investigation revealed that someone had been using weather conditions to mask sabotage operations, creating ice formations that would hide structural damage until aircraft were already airborne. The passengers I had seen were likely the spirits of people who had died in previous sabotage incidents, trying to prevent another tragedy by warning ground personnel about hidden dangers. I continued working de-icing operations, but I started paying closer attention to unusual ice formations and passenger activity in supposedly empty aircraft. Sometimes the dead are the only ones who can see dangers that threaten the living, and their warnings might be the difference between a safe flight and another unexplained aviation disaster. My surveillance monitors showed the same person walking through 3 different terminals simultaneously at 2:47 a.m. What made it impossible was that Camden Porter had been dead for 6 months. Yet he was preventing terrorist attacks across multiple timelines that shouldn't exist. I'm Isabel, and I've worked airport security at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International for 13 years. The overnight shift in the central monitoring station means watching over 200 security cameras, coordinating with TSA checkpoints, and maintaining surveillance on nearly 7 million square feet of terminal space. It's meticulous work that requires constant attention to detail, because airport security operates on the principle that a single missed threat can result in mass casualties. Most nights are routine, monitoring passenger flow, tracking suspicious behavior, and coordinating with law enforcement when situations require intervention. April 22nd started as a typical Sunday night with reduced passenger traffic and minimal security incidents. The international terminals were processing late arrivals from European flights, while domestic operations were winding down after the weekend travel rush. I was monitoring feeds from terminals A, B, C, D, E, and the international concourse when I noticed something that violated the fundamental laws of physics and linear time. At exactly 2:47 a.m., my monitors showed an individual I recognized as Camden Porter walking through security checkpoint Alpha 7 in Terminal A. Simultaneously, the same person was visible on cameras at checkpoint Bravo 12 in Terminal B and checkpoint Charlie 15 in Terminal C. Not someone who looked similar to Camden Porter, but the identical individual wearing identical clothing and exhibiting identical mannerisms at 3 different locations occurring at the same moment. The problem was that Camden Porter had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier while driving home from his security shift at Atlanta's airport. I had attended his funeral, spoken with his family, and processed the paperwork for his employee termination. Yet there he was on my monitors, moving through multiple terminals with the purposeful stride of someone conducting official security business. I checked the timestamp displays on all 3 camera feeds to ensure I wasn't experiencing some kind of equipment malfunction or delayed video playback. All 3 feeds showed real-time surveillance with identical timestamps, confirming that I was witnessing simultaneous events that should have been physically impossible. I rubbed my eyes and checked my coffee intake, wondering if fatigue was causing hallucinations, but the images remained consistent across multiple viewing angles and camera systems. Camden had worked airport security for 8 years before his death, specializing in behavioral threat assessment and suspicious activity recognition. He had an exceptional record for identifying potential security risks, including 2 incidents where his observations had prevented weapons from being brought onto aircraft. His expertise in reading passenger behavior patterns and identifying concealment techniques had made him one of our most valuable security personnel. I decided to focus on one of the 3 simultaneous appearances and selected the Terminal A feed for detailed observation. Camden was moving through the checkpoint area with practiced efficiency, occasionally stopping to observe specific passengers with the kind of focused attention that indicated he had identified potential threats. His behavior was consistent with normal security patrol procedures, except for the fact that he was supposed to be dead. As I watched, Camden approached a middle-aged man wearing a heavy winter coat, despite the April weather in Atlanta. The passenger was standing near Gate A23, apparently waiting for a connecting flight. But his body language suggested extreme nervousness and concealment behavior. Camden positioned himself where he could observe the passenger without being obvious, using reflective surfaces and crowd movement to maintain surveillance. I switched to the Terminal B feed and found the second version of Camden conducting identical surveillance on a different passenger exhibiting similar suspicious behavior near Gate B18. The target was a young woman with multiple carry-on bags who kept checking her watch and looking around nervously as if expecting to meet someone. Camden was maintaining the same professional distance and observation techniques he had used in Terminal A. The Terminal C feed showed the third Camden focusing on an elderly man who was moving through the concourse with unusual urgency for someone his age. The man was carrying a small briefcase and kept checking his phone while avoiding eye contact with security personnel and fellow passengers. So all 3 suspicious individuals were displaying classic indicators of terrorist activity or weapons concealment. I immediately contacted airport police to report the suspicious passengers. But when I tried to explain that I had identified them through surveillance by a deceased security guard who was simultaneously present in 3 terminals, the dispatcher questioned my mental state and suggested I take a break from monitoring duties. I realized that I needed to focus on the potential threats rather than the impossible circumstances of their discovery. Dispatch. This is Central Monitoring. I have 3 suspicious individuals exhibiting threat behavior in Terminals A, B, and C, requesting immediate response teams for behavioral assessment and possible weapons screening. I provided detailed locations and descriptions without mentioning Camden's involvement. Response teams were dispatched to all 3 locations, and what they found validated Camden's threat assessments. The man in Terminal A was carrying components for an improvised explosive device concealed in his winter coat lining. The woman in Terminal B had disassembled firearm parts, distributed among her multiple bags. The elderly man in Terminal C was transporting chemical precursors for poison gas attacks in his briefcase. All 3 individuals were arrested simultaneously, and subsequent investigation revealed they were part of a coordinated terrorist cell, planning to conduct attacks on multiple aircraft departing Atlanta at different times throughout the night. The timing and coordination of their activities suggested extensive planning and inside knowledge of airport security procedures. How did you identify all 3 suspects at the same time? FBI agent Harrison asked during his interview with me the following day. The behavioral indicators were subtle, and they were operating in different terminals with no apparent connection to each other. I struggled to explain that a dead security guard had somehow appeared in 3 locations simultaneously to point out the threats, knowing that such an explanation would end my career and probably result in psychological evaluation. I noticed suspicious behavior patterns during routine surveillance monitoring. The individuals were all exhibiting classic concealment indicators. Your threat identification was remarkably accurate and may have prevented multiple aircraft from being destroyed in flight, Agent Harrison said. The suspects were planning to conduct synchronized attacks on flights departing between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., with an estimated casualty count of over 800 people. The investigation revealed that the terrorist cell had been planning their attacks for over a year. studying airport security procedures and identifying vulnerabilities in the overnight shift operations. They had specifically chosen the April 22nd date because historical data showed reduced security staffing and passenger traffic that would make their activities less likely to be detected. What the investigators never learned was that Camden Porter had somehow transcended death to continue protecting the airport he had served in life. His ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously suggested that death had freed him from the physical constraints that limited living security personnel to observing one location at a time. Over the following months, I continued to see Camden on my surveillance monitors during overnight shifts, always focusing on legitimate security threats and always maintaining the professional standards he had exhibited during his living career. He never acknowledged my presence or responded to attempts at communication, but his threat identifications were consistently accurate and had prevented several additional security incidents. I learned that other overnight security personnel had reported similar experiences with deceased colleagues who continued performing their duties after death. The phenomenon seemed to be limited to security workers who had died while still actively employed at the airport, suggesting that their sense of professional responsibility transcended physical death. The most remarkable aspect was Camden's apparent ability to observe multiple timelines or probability streams simultaneously, identifying threats that existed across different potential realities. His simultaneous appearances in 3 terminals suggested that he was operating outside normal temporal constraints, possibly observing all possible outcomes and focusing on scenarios where intervention was necessary. I never reported the supernatural aspects of my security work, but I continued to trust Camden's threat assessments and alert response teams whenever he identified suspicious individuals. His post-mortem security work saved hundreds of lives and prevented multiple terrorist attacks that would have devastated commercial aviation. Sometimes, the most effective security personnel are those who care too much about protecting innocent lives to let death interfere with their duties. In an environment where vigilance means the difference between safe flights and mass casualties, perhaps some guards are simply too dedicated to their mission to abandon their posts when their shifts officially end. My computer system showed passengers checking in for flights to final destination, scheduled for gates that didn't exist. Every name on the manifest belonged to someone who had died in aviation accidents, and they were all seeking passage to somewhere beyond the living world. I'm Peyton, and I've worked as a gate agent for Delta Airlines at LaGuardia Airport for 12 years. The overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. handles the strangest mix of passengers: red-eye business travelers, international connections, delayed flights from weather issues, and the occasional medical emergency that requires aircraft diversion. Working Terminal C during these hours means dealing with tired, frustrated people who just want to get home, along with the complex logistics of rebooking, upgrades, and gate changes that happen when schedules fall apart. But nothing in my training prepared me. For the night, I discovered that some passengers are traveling to destinations that exist outside normal geography. May 15th began with typical overnight chaos. Thunderstorms had delayed incoming flights from the Midwest, creating a domino effect of missed connections and stranded passengers. I was working Gate C14, processing rebookings for a canceled flight to Minneapolis, when my computer terminal started displaying information that shouldn't have been possible. Mixed in with normal passenger manifests and flight schedules were entries for flights I had never seen before. Flight 1549 to final destination was scheduled to depart from Gate C99 at 3:33 a.m. Gate C99 didn't exist. Terminal C only had gates numbered through C42. More disturbing was the passenger manifest, which showed 155 names of people I vaguely recognized but couldn't immediately place. The flight was listed as on time, with boarding scheduled to begin at 3 a.m., just 20 minutes away. I assumed it was a computer glitch and tried to clear the erroneous flight information, but my system wouldn't allow me to modify or delete the entries. Every time I attempted to access administrative functions, the screen would flash and return to the Flight 1549 display. Other gate agents were busy with their own passenger issues, and I didn't want to create additional problems by reporting system malfunctions during an already chaotic night. At exactly 3 a.m., passengers began approaching my gate counter asking about boarding procedures for Flight 1549. The first was a middle-aged man in a business suit who introduced himself as Captain Chesley Sullenberger. He looked familiar, and when he handed me his boarding pass, I realized why I recognized his name. Captain Sullenberger was the pilot who had successfully landed U.S. Airways Flight 1549 on the Hudson River in 2009, saving all 155 passengers and crew members in what became known as the Miracle on the Hudson. "I believe we're ready for boarding," Captain Sullenberger said with the calm professionalism I remembered from news interviews. "The passengers have been waiting a long time for this flight." I stared at his boarding pass, which showed a departure time of 3:33 a.m. and a destination listed simply as Final Destination. The seat assignment was 1A, and the boarding pass was stamped with validation codes I had never seen before. "Captain, I'm not showing Flight 1549 on my regular departure board. Are you sure you have the correct gate?" "This is definitely the right gate," he replied. "We've been trying to complete this journey for 15 years. Tonight feels different, though. Tonight feels like we might finally reach our destination." More passengers began queuing for boarding, and I recognized several faces from news coverage of aviation incidents. There was Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest Airlines pilot who had safely landed Flight 1380 after an engine explosion in 2018. Behind her was Captain Al Haynes, who had attempted to save United Flight 232 in Sioux City in 1989. The line included flight attendants, air traffic controllers, and passengers from various aviation incidents spanning decades. "I need to verify this flight with my supervisor," I told Captain Sullenberger, reaching for my radio to contact the overnight operations manager. "Peyton," said a voice behind me that made me turn around in shock. It was my colleague, Marcus, a gate agent who had worked Terminal C for 8 years before dying in a car accident 6 months earlier. He was wearing his standard Delta uniform and employee badge, looking exactly as he had during his last shift. "Marcus? But you're—" I couldn't finish the sentence, staring at someone I knew was dead, but who appeared completely normal and professional. "I'm here to help with the boarding process," Marcus said calmly. "Flight 1549 requires special handling procedures. These passengers have earned their passage to Final Destination through their service to aviation safety and their sacrifice in protecting others." I looked back at the boarding queue and realized that every person waiting was connected to aviation heroism or tragedy. Some were pilots who had died trying to save their aircraft and passengers. Others were flight attendants who had perished while evacuating burning planes. Some were air traffic controllers who had died at their posts during emergency situations. "What is Final Destination?" I asked Marcus, though I was beginning to understand the answer. "It's where aviation souls go when their earthly service is complete," he explained. "Pilots who sacrificed their lives for passenger safety, crew members who died protecting others, controllers who stayed at their posts until the end. They earn passage on special flights that depart from airports like this one at specific times." Captain Sullenberger approached the counter again. "Is there a problem with our boarding?" "The passengers are ready to complete their journey." I looked at my computer screen, which now showed Flight 1549 as boarding with all 155 passengers checked in and ready for departure. The aircraft type was listed as Special Service Ethereal Transport, and the departure gate had changed to simply Beyond. "No problem, Captain," I said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "You're cleared for boarding. Please have passengers present their boarding passes as they enter the jet bridge." The boarding process was unlike anything I had experienced in 12 years of gate operations. Each passenger approached with quiet dignity, presenting boarding passes that dissolved into points of light as I scanned them. They moved down the jet bridge with purpose and peace, many nodding their thanks as they passed. The last passenger was a young flight attendant named Betty Ong, who had been killed during the September 11th attacks while providing crucial information about the hijackers to ground personnel. She handed me her boarding pass and said, "Thank you for helping us get home. Some journeys take longer than others, but everyone who serves aviation with honor eventually gets to complete their final flight." As the last passenger disappeared down the jet bridge, my computer terminal returned to normal operations, showing only the standard overnight flight schedule. There was no record of Flight 1549, no passenger manifest, no gate assignment for C99. Marcus was gone, and I was alone at Gate C14 with a handful of regular passengers waiting for the 6:30 a.m. departure to Boston. I never reported the incident, knowing that explaining supernatural boarding procedures would end my career and probably result in psychological evaluation. But I started paying attention to subtle signs that indicated when special flights were scheduled. Computer glitches that displayed impossible destinations, the appearance of deceased colleagues, and the quiet dignity of passengers who were traveling beyond normal geography. Over the following months, I handled boarding for several more flights to final destination. Always during overnight shifts, always involving aviation personnel who had died in service to flight safety, and always departing from gates that didn't officially exist. The passengers were invariably polite, grateful, and peaceful, as if they had been waiting patiently for their final boarding call. I learned that airports serve as more than transportation hubs for the living. They're also departure points for souls who have completed their earthly service in aviation. The dedication required to work in an industry where human error can cause mass casualties creates a special bond between aviation professionals and the concept of safe passage. The most comforting realization was that heroes who die protecting aircraft and passengers don't simply disappear. They earn passage on flights that take them to destinations where their service is honored and their sacrifices are remembered. Sometimes, the most important flights are the ones that don't appear on regular departure boards, carrying passengers who have already paid the ultimate price for their commitment to aviation safety. The in-flight meals I'd been loading contained ingredients that didn't exist in any earthly food database. When I cut open the sealed containers, something that looked like human tissue was writhing inside, and it pulsed with its own heartbeat. I'm Amaya, and I've worked for Phoenix Sky Harbor's Airline catering services for 9 years. Most people never think about where airplane food comes from, but it's a complex operation involving food safety regulations, international health standards, and the logistical challenge of preparing thousands of meals that must remain stable at altitude while being reheated in aircraft galleys. The overnight shift handles meal preparation for early morning departures, international flights, and special dietary requirements that need individual attention. We're responsible for ensuring that every meal loaded onto aircraft meets federal safety standards. Because food poisoning at 35,000 feet can become a life-threatening emergency with no immediate medical facilities available. June 3rd started with an unusual catering order that had arrived through our international client portal. The request was for 342 special meals designated as cultural dietary requirements for Lufthansa Flight 8847, departing Phoenix at 7:15 a.m. with a final destination of Frankfurt, Germany. The order specified ingredients that I had never encountered in 9 years of airline catering. Items with scientific names that didn't correspond to any food products in our standard databases. The ingredient list included synthesized protein complex alpha-7, hydrolyzed mineral substrate, and organic compound series 23B. The preparation instructions were written in technical language that resembled medical or laboratory procedures rather than standard cooking directions. Instead of temperatures and cooking times, the specifications called for cellular activation at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit and molecular bonding through electromagnetic stimulation. What made the order more suspicious was the delivery method. Instead of arriving through our normal supply chain vendors, the ingredients had been delivered directly to our facility by unmarked refrigerated trucks with drivers who spoke no English and refused to provide standard shipping documentation. The containers were sealed with security locks that required special codes to open, and each package was marked with biohazard symbols that I had never seen on food products. I contacted my supervisor, Rodriguez, to verify the unusual order. But he was in a meeting with representatives from what he described as federal food safety inspectors, who were conducting a special audit of our international catering operations. He instructed me to proceed with meal preparation according to the provided specifications, and assured me that all ingredients had been pre-approved through channels above his authority level. The meal preparation area had been modified for this special order, with additional ventilation systems and containment protocols that resembled laboratory safety procedures more than food service standards. I was required to wear protective equipment, including respirators, sealed gloves, and full-body coverage that prevented any skin contact with the ingredients. When I opened the first ingredient container, I immediately knew something was fundamentally wrong. The synthesized protein complex didn't look like any food product I had ever encountered. It appeared to be living tissue that moved independently, pulsing with rhythmic contractions that suggested some kind of cardiovascular activity. The material was warm to the touch, despite having been stored in refrigeration, and it responded to light by contracting away from illumination. The hydrolyzed mineral substrate was even more disturbing. It consisted of crystalline structures that seemed to be growing and reproducing while I watched, forming new geometric patterns that defied natural crystal formation processes. When I touched the container, the crystals oriented themselves toward the contact point and began emitting a low-frequency humming sound that I could feel in my bones. The organic compound series 23B was the most unsettling ingredient. It appeared to be a thick, dark liquid that moved with purpose rather than flowing according to gravity and container shape. The liquid formed tentacle-like projections that explored the edges of its container, and occasionally I could see what looked like primitive sensory organs forming and dissolving within the mass. Following the preparation instructions felt like conducting a scientific experiment rather than preparing airline meals. The ingredients were combined in specific ratios using equipment that measured electromagnetic fields rather than weights and volumes. The cooking process involved exposing the mixture to frequencies of light and sound that activated cellular changes in the organic components. As the meal preparation progressed, the individual ingredients merged into something that looked superficially like standard airline food, but retained characteristics that clearly indicated non-terrestrial origin. The final product pulsed with its own energy, maintained a constant temperature without external heat sources, and occasionally exhibited movement patterns that suggested primitive consciousness. "These meals are going to kill people," I told Rodriguez when he returned from his meeting. "Whatever these ingredients are, they're not safe for human consumption. This isn't food. It's some kind of living biological experiment." Rodriguez looked exhausted and stressed in a way I had never seen before. "Amaya, I need you to understand that this operation is being conducted under federal authority that supersedes normal food safety regulations. The passengers on Flight 8847 have volunteered for a special program, and they're aware of the unusual nature of their meals." "What kind of program requires passengers to eat living tissue?" I demanded. "And why are we preparing it in our facility without proper safety protocols?" "The program involves individuals who have been selected for enhanced nutrition experiments. The goal is to test human adaptability to non-terrestrial food sources in preparation for future space colonization efforts. The passengers have signed extensive waivers acknowledging the experimental nature of their participation." I knew Rodriguez was lying. His body language, his reluctance to make eye contact, and the obvious fear in his voice indicated that he was being coerced into cooperating with something he didn't understand or approve of. The federal inspectors he had met with were likely not government officials at all, but representatives of some organization that had infiltrated airline catering operations for purposes that had nothing to do with space colonization. I completed the meal preparation as instructed, but I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes about the ingredients, preparation procedures, and final products. If passengers were going to be harmed by consuming these meals, there needed to be evidence of what had been done to them and who was responsible. The meals were loaded onto Lufthansa Flight 8847, according to standard catering procedures, with each passenger receiving an individually prepared portion that looked like normal airline food, but contained ingredients that originated from sources outside Earth's biosphere. I watched the aircraft taxi for departure, knowing that 342 people were about to consume biological materials that could potentially alter their physiology in ways that current medical science couldn't predict or treat. Flight 8847 never arrived in Frankfurt. According to official reports, the aircraft experienced catastrophic system failures over the Atlantic Ocean and crashed with no survivors. But the wreckage was never recovered, despite extensive search operations, and several witnesses reported seeing the aircraft change course and disappear from radar in ways that suggested controlled flight rather than mechanical failure. Investigation of the catering operation revealed that the federal inspectors who had authorized the special meals were using fraudulent credentials, and the unmarked delivery trucks had been registered to companies that didn't exist. The ingredient suppliers had no legitimate business addresses, and the payment for the special meals had been processed through accounts that were closed immediately after the transaction. What the investigation didn't uncover was the true purpose of the experimental meals. Through my own research, I discovered that similar catering operations had been conducted at airports around the world, always involving flights that subsequently disappeared without explanation. The pattern suggested a systematic program to test human reactions to alien biological materials, possibly as part of a longer-term plan to gradually introduce non-terrestrial organisms into Earth's food supply. The passengers on these flights weren't volunteers for space colonization experiments. They were unwitting test subjects in an alien infiltration program that used commercial aviation to conduct biological experiments on isolated human populations. The controlled environment of aircraft cabins provided perfect conditions for monitoring human reactions to foreign biological materials without the risk of contamination spreading to larger populations. I continued working airline catering, but with a new understanding that food service operations could be used as cover for activities that had nothing to do with passenger nutrition. Every unusual ingredient request, every special dietary order, every deviation from standard procedures became a potential indicator of non-human influence on human food systems. The most terrifying realization was that alien entities had successfully infiltrated commercial aviation infrastructure using routine operations to conduct experiments on unsuspecting passengers who trusted that their meals met basic safety standards. The thought that every airline meal could potentially contain biological agents designed to alter human physiology added a new dimension of horror to the simple act of eating during air travel. If you've experienced unusual symptoms after consuming airline meals, or if you work in aviation and have noticed strange ingredients or preparation procedures, your story matters. Share your experiences and stay vigilant. Sometimes the greatest threats come from the most ordinary sources. For those interested in sharing their aviation horror stories or discussing paid promotional opportunities, contact VerifiedFears@gmail.com.